desire to learn more about ending life without the possibility of parole, or disparity in the prisons, or virtual life, which means 30 years or more of a sentence, Alex is the person to go to. She's absolutely wonderful. So take it away, Alex.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm exceedingly flattered by that. My name is Alexandra Bailey. I'm the senior campaign strategist at the Sentencing Project. From childhood, mass incarceration has touched mine and my family's life. My childhood, one of the strongest memories of it is when my family member we were fighting to get him off of death row in Louisiana. It has been a driving force behind my entire life, and I'm pleased to be here to talk about it today broadly, but also to talk about campaigns that are happening across the country, and what we can potentially do to help Iowa and the problem that we're seeing in Iowa. I've had the pleasure of actually living in your fair state for several months when I was working for ACLU National during the caucuses. I'm pretty familiar with your state legislature and the problems that you all are facing in Iowa when it comes to criminal justice reform. So because we're on Zoom, and I like to see everybody and everybody to be able to see me so I can see hands and things like that, I'm not going to bore you all too much with a PowerPoint, but I am going to show some videos. When the videos are on, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Use the raised hand function and leave it up so that I can see you. If you have questions, I'm going to leave about 20 minutes for us to be in discussion to answer any questions that you might have. Does that work for everyone? Okay, well, I'm sure you all are aware of this, but it always bears repeating. The United States incarcerates more people than anywhere in the world. That includes China. In that exceedingly large population, we have a couple of what I would consider great national sins. We created incarceration as a method to bypass people's constitutional rights. It has resulted in de facto slavery, disenfranchisement from the ability to vote. It keeps people from housing. It keeps people from re-entering society in any way that they could potentially be successful. And it has not made us safer, and it has not made us better. In addition to everything that I just shared about my background, I'm also a two-time survivor of violent crime. And I still have not come to the conclusion that mass incarceration is something that we need. So why don't we start there? I'm going to put this in the chat, but there's a great report that recently came out called Reflections on Long Prison Sentences, and it is a conversation with crime survivors. So a multitude of entities that specialize in survivorship from violent crime got together and facilitated research discussions between people who were survivors of violent crime or family members who had lost their lives, as well as people who had served extreme prison sentences and their family members. And they, with the overarching goal of actually presenting this report to district attorneys and judges in all 50 states who had the highest numbers of convictions, to encourage them to take a potentially different tact. So one of the major things that came out of that was a list of recommendations of what we should do. And I'll put this in the chat for everybody to look in your own time. But prison sentences, including long prison sentences, should serve the purpose of rehabilitation. What we know about America's prison system is that we do not rehabilitate. Our prison system is antithetical to both mental health and physical health. Unfortunately, Iowa has some very egregious examples of this. which was part of the reason that I was so incredibly inspired and pushed for us to support Sue's books about Iowa and those first-person stories. If you have not read those books yet, please go into the chat and order them. I highly recommend them. We've passed it around the Sentencing Project. You know, we know all the data inside and out, but it's really those personal stories that will highlight for you exactly what these statistics feel like for the individual. The other thing that this report that I referred to came to is that long sentences are not synonymous with accountability. Rather, accountability comes from taking responsibility for harm. Now, I know you all have probably heard this in the news somewhere, but if we're dealing with violent crime, then the thing that we need to do is have harsher sentencing laws and longer prison sentences. What the data actually shows us is that that is not true and does not make us safer. The vast majority of crimes, including up to murder, are actually not caught. Less than 13% of all violent crime actually results in anyone actually being caught or convicted. And in those instances, areas that are over-policed, predominantly Black and brown communities, are the people who not only because of that are taken into the system, but are given these longer sentences. In addition to those sort of like terrible stats about racial disparities is the fact that people who cause harm actually don't ever get the chance to take accountability because they're put away for life. The United States now has also the largest population of aging lifers. In many states, we're seeing 50 moving towards 60%, where the people who are incarcerated in that state are 55 and older. It's when you say 55, a lot of people might think, oh, that's not that old, right? The average rate of survival in prison as of our most recent data is 53 years old. So your chances of living beyond that age, if you are given a life sentence, are exceedingly slim. The other worrisome thing as we come up to 50 years that's happening is that not only have we over-policed, we've led the world in incarceration, we've led the world in death penalty, we've led the world in LWOP, we've led the world in racial disparities, but we have seen a 400% increase in the incarceration of women since the 1980s. Unfortunately, Iowa is also tracking this trend. And the interesting thing about the incarceration of women is where normally we see a disproportionate amount of Black and brown people being the highest spike of growth in a prison population. Amongst women, we're actually seeing a flattening of that curve across race, with white women actually being one of the largest sections of increase for the incarceration of women. So why is all of this happening? Why have we not taken these numbers down? It's starting to cost us more money. What is the problem? We don't have mechanisms for release. Life without the possibility of parole actually comes with fewer opportunities for case review than the death penalty does. So pretty much in most places, once you're done, you're done. Virtual life sentences, which as Sue pointed out, are sentences that we consider to be 30 years or older, or sentences that by the number assigned to you would take you to the end of your natural life, are also rampant in this country. In Iowa, in particular, this is the most recent data, 262 of every 100,000 citizens is incarcerated. That's fairly staggering, right? The Black to white disparity is 9-to-1. So even in a state where the vast majority of the population is white, you have an extreme racial disparity between people who are Black and Latinx to white people. And despite many states moving away from the incarceration of children, Iowa, unfortunately, as of the most recent data, has 441 children who are currently incarcerated in your state. And without any meaningful mechanism to address these extreme sentences, The United States and Iowa, as part of that, are going to continue to grow our numbers of people who are incarcerated and be unable to address what is currently happening. At the Sentencing Project, I'm certainly not the smartest person on our staff by any stretch of the imagination, but I do get to run our campaigns. And my specialty is legislative solutions to mass incarceration. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some of the neighbors of Iowa are doing, share a few videos about that. And I would ask that you as a community, as a group of activists, as citizens who care, if you decide that any of these campaigns are appropriate for you all, to please, how we define incarcerated for juveniles or charged with adult and being in adult jails or prisons. So it's a different number for people who were charged as adults and sentenced to JLWOP, juvenile life without the possibility of parole. 441 are the amount of children who are currently held in correctional facilities, either at the adult level or the child level. So you guys have facilities of both kinds. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. Where was I? Okay, so in terms of legislation that we're working on right now, the Sentencing Project is focusing on 3 overarching types of legislation that have the opportunity to help us address extreme sentences across the country with high impact numbers. For the more conservative states, we are focusing on a law called DVS-JA, Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Acts. Now, the interesting thing about these laws is they do not just cover what most people think of when they think of domestic violence, right, which is intimate partner violence. They also cover familial violence and the type of trauma that comes from people who are in close relation to people who then commit offenses. Your, well, not too far off neighbors in Oklahoma, a DVS-JA bill actually has just gone live. It is sponsored by Representative Hassenbeck, who is a Republican. And what this law will do is 2-pronged. It will retroactively go back and review cases where this type of violence was present for the person who committed this offense. It does not necessarily have to be a case where the person killed their abuser, right? That's very much only sort of one element of this. What it also addresses is what we know about coercive behavior when it comes to the commission of crimes. Some very sad things in particular drive mass incarceration, particularly for women in Oklahoma, which has the highest rate of female incarceration in the country and per capita the world. They have very unique laws. One in particular is called failure to protect. They incarcerate a multitude of women because they could be in the commission of a violent crime happening to them. But if during the commission of that, a child is in any way harmed, prosecutors have the ability to prosecute them for failing to protect that child. This comes with up to a life sentence. Yeah, I know, right? You make you shake your head. So this law that we're working on, the Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act, will also help us walk that back. I actually had the pleasure of talking with some of the foremost professors in the state of Oklahoma yesterday about the research that they were doing about women in trauma, specifically in Oklahoma. And the news that came to me actually was very, very sad. So usually when you're conducting research, you have the group of people that you're studying, and then you have a control group. So you can basically do a comparison. What do regular people experience versus this group of people? When the professors went into the prison, they asked for women who would self-identify as survivors of domestic violence, to which they got a handful of people that they then interviewed. Then they decided to interview the other incarcerated women, thinking that they would be their control group for this research. Although they didn't self-identify, the level of abuse was such across all of the women in the prison that they could not find a control group in the incarcerated women. They had to redo the study and take their control group to general population. If any of you know about ACE scores, which is a score between 1 and 10, which assesses trauma. A 3-4 is what we would identify as a person having complex trauma, right? A multitude of things have happened to them that have traumatized them throughout their life. If a person's at a 3 or 4, if you are in this business, you find this highly concerning. This person needs help, they need therapy. Amongst the women who are incarcerated in Iowa, the average score, so the average score actually is pulling from the top, if you will, was a 7 out of 10 being the maximum. That was the average ACE score. What was even more concerning beyond this is there was a larger study done in correlation with this about the connection between the abuse and criminality that we saw in women. Now, if you're in the research world, we rate these things between 0 and 1. So if you're doing research and you get something that shows up at a 5 or a 6, you've stumbled upon something really important in research. That means that this happens more often than not. This research found 2 very disturbing things. The first is any woman who had a threat of death or significant physical violence that was researched and had committed a crime. Actually, I'll take a guess here. You know what? I'll pick on Sue real quick. Since you do this kind of research, I'm going to pick on you just real quick. So between 0 and 1, with 5 or 6 being significant, how high do you think this rating was?
5, 4.
0.92.
Oh, well, okay, 0.9.
What this research basically showed is that if a woman had her life threatened in Iowa, if an abuser said, I'm going to kill you or I'm going to do a specific thing to you, statistically speaking, it was almost a guarantee that that would actually happen. Now, this all makes sense given the fact that they lead the country in the rate of women who are killed by intimate partners. And this is why we are fighting to pass a Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act. But also because we need to set up in these states an ability to resentence. And unfortunately, domestic violence is often one of the few ways that people actually understand how trauma interacts with criminality. So I'm going to show a real short video about the laws around failure to protect that was actually in the news very recently, created by Mother Jones. I will give everybody a trigger warning right now that this is particularly disturbing. So feel free to step away if you are a survivor or you find this type of thing particularly traumatic. I'll just pull this up for you here. Make sure I share my screen. Can everybody see this? Thumbs up, good, great.
Where is your mom and why is she there?
She's in prison because I don't really know how to explain it.
Having sound issues here, Alex.
Was it the right amount or did we make a mistake?
Any other person I've told about it, everyone just thinks it's not right.
Her only crime is not getting help when she should have.
If I would have known, it would have definitely changed my mind, and I guarantee it would have changed many others on the jury as well.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from an incarcerated individual at Naval Bassett Correctional Center.
I really believe that, if I told the truth, then, everything was going to be okay. but it doesn't work that way.
Carrie King didn't hurt her children, but she spent the last 7 years locked in a cell because someone else close to her did. I'm Samantha Michaels, a criminal justice reporter for Mother Jones.
I'm reaching out because I'm working on a documentary.
When I learned about a little-known law that's tearing apart families and targeting women, disproportionately women of color, I went to Oklahoma to look into Carrie's case myself.
When I first went to jail, Persia was 8, William was 7, Lila was 5, and then she turned 6 that year.
Persia, look at Persia's face. She looks all angry.
With Carrie now in prison, her 3 oldest children live with their dad and Carrie's ex-husband, Jordan Lale Parvaran.
Is this Uncle Sloan?
And that's Uncle Floyd.
Oh, Uncle Floyd, yeah. That's Dad.
Persia's personality, she's really silly when you can get her to be. Lila, she likes to joke a lot, but then that artistic side of her, you know, she'll get real serious when she's drawing. William, he is my little sweet man. He's kind of a little bit of a smart aleck sometimes, just a little bit.
We also have this picture.
What's this one?
It's a picture of my mom.
That's super cute. Can you tell me, where is this?
That's at the prison she's at now.
Jordan and Carrie were married for 5 years. He abused her repeatedly, and in 2011, he went to prison for domestic violence. Carrie started dating a man named John. That relationship turned abusive too. John used heroin. He forced Carrie to try it. He hit, cut, and choked her, but Carrie said she never saw him hurt her kids. But one night, when they were both high, Carrie woke up to find John in Lila's bedroom.
He had his hands like this on her, his fingers kind of around her neck. I asked him, what's going on? What are you in here doing with my kid? And he says, oh, nothing, we're just pillow fighting. And then she starts to whimper, and I just hit him. He jumped on top of me immediately and started hitting me and choking me and tells me, what makes you think you can hit me? He grabs me by my hair and starts pulling me out and throwing me into the wall. And he tells me she had to be punished.
John ordered Carrie to hold Lila down so he could spank her. Carrie reluctantly agreed.
What do you believe is going to happen if you don't let him punish her?
That it could get worse and he could end up killing us.
She hoped that if she complied with his demand, the beating would end quicker.
He hit her twice. I told him he's hitting her too hard. I climbed on top of her.
Carrie threw her body across her daughter, absorbing his belt lashes on her own back.
I'm telling him, just leave her alone, leave her alone, leave her alone. Then he grabs me by the hair and pulls me off and throws me into the wall.
Carrie tried to run out of the house to get help.
I got to the front door, halfway opened it, pushes it closed, and pushes me up against the wall and starts choking me. He tells me, you ain't going nowhere.
Carrie was now separated from her daughter, Lila. John had her cell phone. She wasn't able to call the police.
It was so horrible, and it seemed like forever. I just wanted to go in there, but I was so scared.
So Carrie, unfortunately, is still incarcerated. We're in touch with her, and she's using her story about the DVS-JA law that we're fighting for. During the course of that trial, the prosecutor said to her, how dare you portray yourself as the victim? She was sentenced to 32 years. I wish I could say that this was a unique case, but it is not, and it is not across the country. In Michigan, a good friend of mine is currently serving a life without the possibility of parole sentence for fighting off a man who stabbed her in her pregnant stomach. This is exceedingly common. In Oklahoma City alone, there were 40,000 phone calls this past year about DV situations. Unfortunately, and I haven't had the chance to dig into every county in Iowa, but you all also have very disturbing rates of domestic violence calls that result in no prosecution and no intervention. I would imagine that if you all too are assessed for a DVS-JA law, you might potentially find this hopeful. And if you read Sue's books, as I have, I would imagine that you all would feel the way that I do about this being a potential route forward for your state. The other bucket of legislation that the Sentencing Project is working on outside of DVSJA is a type of legislation called Second Look. Second Look is a mechanism whereby a person can apply after having served an extensive amount of time in prison to see if continued punishment is appropriate. They apply to their sentencing judge or whoever is currently occupying that bench. We currently have that legislation live in Vermont, New York State, Michigan, Florida, and Nebraska are all considering this legislation actively at this time. And I'm happy to share model language with you all should you decide that that is something that you as a group would like to pursue. Second Look is becoming incredibly popular across the country, even with departments of corrections, because they are facing a universal problem almost everywhere in the country. Two things. One, most departments of corrections are chronically understaffed, particularly since COVID. And the second is they have an increasing amount of aging population that they simply cannot afford. To incarcerate a person for a lifetime on average costs about $3 million. In states like Michigan and much of the Midwest, there are often thousands of lifers. Michigan has 5,000. That's a great deal of money that probably could be spent more productively somewhere else. And the last bucket of legislation that we focus on is straight up life without parole repeals. And we do that in states that are known to be more progressive for the simple reason that most people cannot wrap their heads around the fact that a life sentence really doesn't make sense. But life without the possibility of parole for many states has become the trade-off to the death penalty. It's considered to be more humane. We won't kill them. We'll just lock them up for the entirety of their lives. Not only is this sentence actually antithetical to what we've done historically, when we first established life without the possibility of parole laws, most people actually got paroled after about 12 to 17 years on average. The concept of actually keeping people in prison for life really came in when we jumped on the mass incarceration trend and really picked up steam during the 1980s and 90s, when we did massive sentencing increases, mandatory minimums, and an ability to stack charges and to allow for consecutive and not just concurrent sentencing. Yes, Sue, thank you very much. You all have 780 lifers currently, but your virtual sentencing is also highly concerning. While the LWOP numbers are not as high as some, people serving extreme sentences in Iowa is exceedingly high per capita based on population. So actually, I'm going to stop there very quickly and ask, does anybody have any outstanding questions at this time or thoughts? Or did that video just depress everybody to such an extent that you want to get the hell off this call?
No, I got a question. This is Lisa. So can you explain again what the law, the law that you want to change as far as the domestic violence and the women that have, killed their partner because they're, in the abuse? Can you explain that again?
So the DVSJA law does not just cover people who kill their partner. Okay. It also includes any crime where there was a traumatic coercive event that led to that was a catalyst to that crime. So this also includes things like, imagine like felony murder, right? A woman is living in a house with somebody who is selling drugs, let's say, and is in an abusive situation. It's far more thoroughgoing than that. But very frequently, the cases that get highlighted are the ones that people understand, right? Like the case that's all over Iowa right now is a woman named April Wilkins. 3 restraining orders, 2 rape kits later, the cops had done nothing. She got dragged down to his basement, sexually assaulted for hours while she was handcuffed. She managed to get the gun off him while handcuffed and shoot him 8 times, and she's serving a life sentence in Oklahoma, right? These are the cases that most people understand, but the laws that we write are far more thoroughgoing than that. And actually, the first person to ever receive DVSJA relief in this country is a man named Malumba from New York State, who killed his father because of the ongoing abuse that he was committing towards the entire family, and most specifically his sister, who was schizophrenic, right? So what we've actually found is that men also have been recipients and beneficiaries of this law, because it sort of opens up the Pandora's box of how trauma and abuse and the commission of offenses really just walk a line together. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And thank you for that explanation.
My pleasure. Karen, is that your hand I see?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You know, here in Iowa, I believe, I'm going to cross my fingers and hope my history is accurate, but I think we gave up the death penalty when we sold the idea of life without the possibility of parole. And I think that was back in the 60s, if I remember correctly, under Harold Hughes when he was our governor. But, you know, there are legislators right now that year after year bring up legislation to bring back the death penalty. And I'm not necessarily myself feeling like we must have life without the possibility of parole, but I do feel like it's going to give a lot of ammunition to those people who want to bring back the death penalty if we try to do away with life without the possibility of parole. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. As somebody who sort of deals with the trade-off of legislatures and what it is that they could potentially do. Part of the reason I brought up DVSJA to you all is that it is a piece of legislation that some of the most conservative states in the union, arguably, are considering as a resentencing law. Louisiana is considering this bill. Oklahoma is considering this bill. These are states with massive carceral populations. But what DVSJA does also support is that a lot of those women are lifers. A lot of the people who have been recipients of DVSJA were lifers. And so it's sort of the first opening act, if you will, of addressing the fact that there are people who are very inappropriately are serving extreme sentences. They come out, they do not recidivate. And then you have much more sort of an argument going forward about why these types of extreme sentences are not effective. You know, as you can see, even from this story, and it's true statistically across the board, the vast majority of the people who are incarcerated are not incarcerated because they are irredeemable psychopaths. They're usually people who've made one mistake in life, or in some cases, the mistake that she made was trying to help her daughter, right? Trying to survive that situation. So that's part of the reason I introduced this. But at this juncture, in my professional opinion, do I think that Iowa could pass a repeal of life without the possibility of parole? No, absolutely not. But I do think you could potentially pass other resentencing laws that could open some folks' eyes.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Are there any other questions or comments? And feel free to unmute yourselves if you can't find the hand button.
Could I just add something to that, Alex?
Please.
This is Sue.
Yeah.
As far as life without parole in Iowa, we are not trying right now, the legislation that we have put forward and supported was not trying to end life without parole, because we really don't want to be hooked up with the idea of bringing back the death penalty. What we are trying to do is get the Iowa legislature and the Board of Parole and the governor to honor the commutation process. so that people who have life without parole can actually have a valid chance of getting their sentence commuted to the possibility of parole. Not necessarily parole, but the possibility of parole. We recognize that there are people who belong in prison. It's not a matter of opening the gate and letting everybody out. It's a matter of giving those people who actually have reformed a chance, a second chance at the possibility of parole.
Absolutely. Is it Mariellis?
Wow, you actually said that really well. It is Mariellis.
Beautiful name. Thank
you so much. So I have a question regarding the domestic abuse. So I have a fiance who's currently incarcerated in Iowa State Penitentiary, and he has a life without parole. And he, in his situation, it's like a little, obviously I don't want to go into too much detail or, because I don't want to take too much time, but there was a lot of domestic violence leading up to like his age where the crime was taking place and during the situation. Is that something that if it's not like parental or like relationship wise, it was like friendship wise, would that be considered a domestic abuse from a friendship as well? Like being is that something that I can look into for him or he can look into, or is that just like on a more in-depth scope?
This law hasn't passed yet in Iowa, but I'll get on Sue and IJAN's radar and see if I can't, I can't talk them over to the dark side. But I can send you all of the laws that currently exist. And actually, I'll drop in the chat the first man who ever received this relief. He's literally the kindest person I know. He's actually a Quaker. Let me put this in the chat for you.
Thank you so much.
He was released after 15 years in prison. He had a virtual life sentence. But his crime was exceedingly violent. He slit his father's throat. And his father had this very long history of abusing his mother and his sisters, one of whom was schizophrenic, who he refused to medicate, even though he was a doctor himself. He was an MD. And when he decided he was going to kill their daughter who had schizophrenia, he decided that he had had enough. And because his father was a doctor, nobody believed them, any of them. And when they asked for witness statements initially in this case, even his school nurse, who had known him when he was a child, came forward to say, like, I literally used to patch this kid up on a regular basis. And he still ended up in Sing Sing for 15 years of his life. Our system is not very good at taking into account the totality of situations. And we judge people by a terrible moment in time and put them away for life. I don't know where everybody on this call falls when it comes to these various concepts. I'm sure that there is a wide swath of feelings, but I would really encourage folks to watch the videos and to read the data that I've put into the chat and come to your own conclusions to whether or not you think this is a good system. Carla, I see your hand up.
My pastor has a saying, which is so true, sad but true. The system is working just like they intended it to work.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of people who don't intend for it to work like that anymore. So I guess they're going to have to deal with this, huh? So like I said, my background is in legislating, in legislative policy and organizing. I started out as a community organizer. And Marshall Gans, the man who trained me at Harvard Kennedy, said to me, organized people are the only thing that can beat organized systems. They're the only thing that ever has. Which is why I'm so glad that you all are getting together to organize in Iowa. Mr. Robinson, do I see your hand up? You're still muted, Mr. Robinson. I'm going to ask you to unmute if you just hit the button. There we go.
Roughly what percent of people in prison in Iowa are illiterate or mentally ill or both?
I will have to go pull the literacy. I do not have a direct answer for, but I can go find one for you. In terms of mental illness and trauma are very highly correlated. And I don't know the ACE score of everybody who's currently incarcerated in Iowa, but I would take an educated guess and say that if we were to go do a full workup on everybody who's currently incarcerated in Iowa, we would find a very disturbing trend in that regard, as we have in almost every prison where we actually have that data. But what I can do is go find that data for you. We do not specialize in rates of literacy within prisons, but I can see what I can find for you.
Well, thank you. I read an essay many years ago in the Atlantic called The Prison Industrial Complex. And they talked about that. And it's back in the days when a Republican named Reagan was governor of California and one named Rockefeller was governor of New York. And the liberal,
yes, Rockefeller, the Rockefeller drug laws. I'm fighting them in New York State right now.
And the liberal in New York was packing the prisons and building more. And the Republican conservative in California was lowering the prison population to all-time lows.
Yeah,
has a little to do with this.
I was just at Attica, actually. It's still bad. Deborah, do I see your hand up?
Yep, I would add that there's probably a high percentage of prisoners who have learning disabilities. As I witnessed my son, who had an IEP K through 12, and just how that affected him. That mental health aside, I would say learning disabilities as well. That was just my thought.
I mean, it's unbelievably true. Everything that you all would probably identify as a societal problem, we have set up prison as the solution in so many instances. And I personally take great issue with this. But to your point, Deborah, my family member who was almost executed by the state, the only reason he wasn't and was given life without the possibility of parole is because he had learning disabilities that our family, because we cared about him, had documented. And that was the only reason that he wasn't killed at 18 years old.
Huh.
So yeah, that stuff gets pretty serious pretty quickly. Pam, do I see your hand up?
Yeah, and Sue or Lisa asked a question earlier, and I just wanted to mention she works with domestic violence locally and particularly with women of color.
Thank you.
So she is quite a resource. So either she or Sue might know this better than I, but what I've at least heard, if not read, is almost every woman at Mitchellville is dealing with depression, other mental illness, or substance abuse problems.
Unfortunately, that's not surprising. That shocks me not at all.
It's 80% documented.
Okay.
80% documented.
Could you send me that data set?
I sure will.
Thank you.